New figures in the last hour for the last 24 hours, and it is now more than 200,000 confirmed cases, 209,000 here in Russia across the country. That's 11,000 over the last 24 hours, almost a record, and it's now 7 days in a row that we've had more than 10,000 cases per day. So yes, very high numbers, still sharply spiking here in Russia. But there is some criticism of those tests. Even Moscow's Department of Health has admitted that these tests don't catch all cases. They've said that, particularly at late stages of the disease, they've observed false negatives. So people who are very in hospital with what doctors can see is clearly COVID-19, but the tests are coming back negative. These are Russian-made tests, which Russia has previously been very proud of. They say, though, that they're using other methods to diagnose coronavirus and are not missing cases. For example, just clinical cases, just seeing the diagnosis, the symptoms that have been observed. And they're also using antibody tests to try and detect via another means whether COVID-19 has been in a patient's body. But of course, very worrying for people who want to know the full scale of this outbreak. Moscow's mayor said that he believes there could be as many as triple the number of cases in Moscow as have been officially detected in those figures. He also said, though, that he believes that the number of hospitalizations, the number of people with moderate or severe pneumonia that requires hospital, is stable, and he sees that as a much more reassuring sign going forward that this outbreak is under control.
Now, testing problems that you've described aside, Lucy, how has Russia's response been different from the rest of the world? It seems to have been hit much later than so many other countries.
Yes, and I think that's because in the beginning of this outbreak, there were some quite tough measures. When the illness was largely contained to China, Russia acted very quickly because, of course, China's right on its doorstep of the east of Russia, not just closing the border with China there on the eastern side of Russia, but also closing the borders full stop to Chinese people coming into Russia. And even testing people in the streets who were Chinese or of Asian appearance. So at that early stage, there were some people criticising Russia's response as a form of racial profiling. They even told people to report people of Asian appearance that they saw walking around the streets, and anyone who had come in from China was asked to isolate for a fairly long time. So very early on, there were very tough measures, and Russia certainly credits that as the reason why it was later to hit. This was treated for a long time as a threat from the outside that Russia could insulate against by closing its borders. And now we have virtually no flights in and out in Russia to anywhere in the world, virtually no arrivals. So they're very much seeing that as a tough measure. On the other hand, though, the measures inside Russia were fairly late to be imposed compared to other countries in the world. So Moscow has been in partial lockdown since the end of March. Many workplaces have been closed since then, but it was a bit later, and there has been some criticism of how it was enforced in the early stages. It felt very much like business as usual for longer here in Russia than it did in other parts of Europe, for example. So those two factors combined have a later outbreak of the epidemic. But as I say, those numbers as they are at the moment do appear to still be rising. Russia, though, puts that down to increased testing, which it says is catching a lot of asymptomatic cases. It says those numbers rising isn't necessarily indicative of an outbreak out of control.
And Lucy, what kind of a threat does the health crisis and the subsequent economic crisis pose right now to Vladimir Putin?
Well, those two things combined are certainly very difficult for any political leaders, and Vladimir Putin hasn't been immune to that at all. The latest independent polling about his approval ratings shows that he's got the lowest approval ratings since 1999 when he'd just taken over. So definitely seeing that in his numbers. On the other hand, those approval ratings have always been very high, and they are still very high compared to other countries, about 59%. So it's not a crisis for him by any means, and it's still a way off until any new presidential election in any case. However, there has been criticism of how he's handled this. He's delegated it very much to regional governors, and in a way that many say is justified because, of course, the size of Russia as a country, it's a world unto itself. So this illness will spread in a different way across the different regions of Russia. But he has been criticised in some quarters for delegating decisions about lockdowns to regional governors rather than making nationwide decisions. He's also been criticised for not having enough economic help for people. Some small businesses here in Moscow, for example, which haven't been allowed to open, saying there isn't enough financial support for them. But as I say, not a crisis by any means. The main blow for him, for his perspective at the moment, was this constitutional referendum, which was due to take place in April, which could have seen him given an extra 12, potentially up to 12 years in power because of changes to presidential term limits and the way that those are applied. That's had to be postponed because it's simply not safe to hold a referendum at this time, and it's probably that in particular that he'll be most nervous about and most looking forward to getting those changes back into the back before the public to get them signed into law as soon as he can.
Thank you so much. Journalist Lucy Taylor speaking to us live from